I'm delighted to announce this afternoon that the United States will be taking a small portion of the hundreds of billions of dollars we receive in tariffs, and we're going to be giving and providing it to the farmers in economic assistance.
It's become almost impossible to think of U.S. farming without government payments supporting it. And the U.S. is far from the only country that intervenes in agricultural markets. But it turns out that there is one country, New Zealand, that has gone a very different way with some unexpected results.
The government wiped those subsidies in 1 year, and the net result of that has been staggering.
America started down its path to paying its farmers back in 1933, in the midst of the Great Depression, when President Roosevelt announced the Agriculture Adjustment Act.
With the whole world in turmoil, even the united efforts of the farmers themselves would not have been sufficient without the cooperation of the government of the United States.
In a recent report covering 54 countries, the OECD found that, quote, agriculture support policies generated on average $842 billion per year in transfers towards agriculture between 2022 and 2024. Dan Glickman was Secretary of Agriculture during the Clinton administration.
Well, first of all, there's a huge amount of agriculture subsidies in the United States. I mean, it's billions and billions of dollars. I think that first of all, farm programs are complicated, and nobody understands them except people in farm countries. So, you know, you have people who have to deal with them all the time, are largely the only ones that have been involved in the writing of them. But look, farming is a precarious, tough business. These people have to deal with drought, disease, floods, tariffs, geopolitical issues. To a soybean grower, China was kind of the salvation. We were exporting, you know, millions and millions of tons of soybeans to China. And when the president announced his tariffs, they were kind of off again, on again, but the impact of that was for the Chinese to kind of cut us off and go to Brazil and Argentina, and it just created a lost market for America, and it was hard to make that up. And that instability that occurred as a result of that meant that a lot of grain elevators were full and the grain couldn't be sold, or the uncertainty of production in the next year or two. So it was really, you talk about a dagger in the heart of American agriculture.
Yet across America and around the world, businesses in all sectors are forced to adapt to changing macroeconomic conditions without the promise of government assistance should things go south. What makes farming different? In the Depression era, national food security was critical, but America now produces far more food than it consumes.
There was a time that we thought that free markets helped discipline conduct in all sorts of places. Is there a risk with farm subsidies of basically becoming less efficient in farming?
That is a very good question. There's no question that farm subsidies kind of skew the economics, the market economics of agriculture. After all, if we're supporting a crop with government subsidies, then no longer is the market alone determining the price or the location or what you produce. And that is a problem. And also it skews the differences between the commodities. You may be supporting corn more than soybeans or wheat more than corn or those kinds of things. And so that does create inefficiencies within the marketplace. On the other hand, we will probably never get rid of farm subsidies.
But what if America, or any country around the world, did get rid of farm subsidies? It turns out that there is one such country. In the early 1980s, New Zealand's economy was in trouble. Its main export market, Great Britain, had just joined what would later be called the European Union, and public spending was at an unsustainable level.
We were within months of being bankrupt.
Lockwood Smith is a farmer himself and a former agriculture minister in New Zealand. In 1984, he'd just been elected to Parliament for the first time.
By the early 1980s, the level of support across our three main livestock industries, if you like, dairy, beef production, and sheep meat or lamb, the average sort of producer subsidy equivalent across all those industries got up to 30%. But it differed among the industries. For beef and dairy, it was only about 13%, less than 20. But for lamb, the producer subsidy equivalent got up to 90%. Basically, 90% of the revenue coming into sheep farmers' pockets was from subsidies of various kinds. And of course, they responded to that because they got more subsidy if they had more sheep. And our sheep numbers climbed progressively up to 70 million. By 1984, we had 70 million sheep. And we couldn't export all the product of those 70 million sheep. We ended up turning thousands of frozen sheep carcasses into fertilizer because we couldn't, we didn't have the markets to export that stuff. And so the economy was in crisis, saw the writing on the wall. I mean, we were within months of bankruptcy, if you like. And in 1985, they decided action had to be taken, and they abolished. In 1 year, they abolished all those subsidies. They wiped many of the tariffs protecting other industries. They abolished all of the subsidies for agriculture, wiped them in 1 year. I wouldn't recommend that anyone else should try to do that, but that's what happened here.
The immediate aftermath was tough, and some farms went out of business.
Probably the biggest protests I've ever seen on the front steps of the New Zealand Parliament were that year in 1985. I remember the newspaper headlines, the roar from the hills as farmers, gathered on the steps of Parliament and all the surrounding streets protesting against the removal of those subsidies.
Peter Jex Blake is a retired farmer on New Zealand's east coast. He's since handed his farm off to his daughter, but remembers it all too well.
Yeah, I remember I was a part of a protest group that the Prime Minister David Long and a few of his ministers arrived at Gisborne Airport one day, and a whole lot of us went out there with placards and started banging on his car windscreen because he wasn't having a bar of talking to us. So we went to every intersection that he was stopping and waving our placards and saying, holding up our bank statements showing, 18-20% interest rates is impossible. He said, change banks. I mean, they had no sympathy at all for farmers.
I was probably too young. Through the 80s, I was only a baby. So, no, I couldn't remember any of the hard times, but I always remember, even right through, Mum and Dad always trying to save money in every way and never overspend.
The immediate aftermath was tough. Although farmers did agree that there was a need for subsidy reform, they felt it was too swift and that they were unfairly targeted.
What happened was they sort of took the subsidies off before they did any other economic reform. So farmers wore the brunt of it for a few years. Basically, your income halved, land prices halved, interest rates went through the roof, inflation was trucking along 15-16%. So because none of the other parts of the economy had been reformed, pretty tough going. Fertiliser use dropped in half. So basically you just toughed it out, where everybody of my generation were living on a smell of an oily rag. It took from 1984, which is when the really hit the fan, it was 10 years really of not making much progress at all. You just you're able to gradually do some improvements, but things didn't really turn the corner until the mid-1990s.
But things did eventually turn a corner.
The result has been quite stunning, actually. It was hard initially, but the improvement in productivity since then has been stunning. Because you either changed what you're doing, or you did lose your farm, you went out of business. And so, they started introducing new genetics into our sheep flock, because it was the sheep industry was affected the most because it had the highest level of subsidies. They brought in new breeds of sheep like Finnish landrace and a breed developed in New Zealand Perindales to improve the fecundity, or the number of lambs that a ewe had, from being just one lamb to 2 and more. Today we have more than about 150% lambing percentages compared with less than 100% back then. They introduced new terminal sires to improve the growth rate of the lambs being born in the flock. They improved our pasture management practices, so we got better utilisation of our pastures, because in New Zealand here, of course, all our livestock farming is conducted outside, just out in the natural environment, just grazing pasture. And the net result of that has been staggering. Today, our sheep numbers have come down from 70 million in 1984 to less than 26 million today. Yet the amount of lamb or sheep meat that we produce is pretty similar, not much less than we used to produce when we had 70 million sheep. And it's quite a stunning story. The productivity improvement in our sheep industry has been since 1990, when the things settled down after the changes. Productivity improvement has been 170%, which is, if every other industry in New Zealand had done that, we'd be a wealthy country.
Agriculture is still a major part of New Zealand's economy, accounting for around 70% of goods exports. But it remains largely unsubsidized, and its farmers wouldn't have it any other way.
We're not getting any assistance from other than what we generate on farm to mitigate emissions, etc. And that, everything we do is a plus for the environment. And the fact, you put fertiliser, you build up the organic matter in the land. Pretty cool when you see other farming systems around the world how reliant on grain and subsidies.
So could the New Zealand model be applied elsewhere? We spoke with farmers in Iowa last summer about the role of subsidies in their work.
Biggest thing, I guess for me as a farmer is I want to make sure we have markets. I don't want direct payments. I would rather not have direct payments from the government. If we can have markets that will buy the grain and stuff from us, not have to depend on the government for and develop those markets.
We don't want to rely on government payments. That's the last thing that we want to do. We've worked to try to eliminate that, and we want to try to create demand through domestic markets, through exports, to offset that.
It's easy to think about a world where farmers don't rely on direct payments from the government, where we create products for the market instead of creating markets for the products, where we encourage innovation through competition. Dan Glickman says that what might be thinkable as a matter of economics may well be unthinkable as a matter of politics.
Every senator has a large amounts of farm country and farm products and farmers, and they're a huge part of their constituency, and they have equal power. So the senator from North Dakota has equal power to the senator in California. That's the dominant factor. Then you have other factors, like the fact that Iowa has been the first caucus in the country historically. That's changing. But Iowa is, people go there and they talk about corn. Even Bernie Sanders talks about corn subsidies and doesn't really rail against them. And it doesn't matter what your political party you're in, Republican or Democrat, liberal or conservative. For the most part, everybody kind of talks about markets working, but it looks like we're going to have subsidies of some sort forever.